Good evening. Or evening for me, I'd like to tell you a story that came from one of the feast storybooks, from the food one. And it's called The Last LADDOO. There was an old couple, a miserly couple, that lived together quite happily, but they would not spend money. They had some, but they wouldn't spend it. They didn't spend it on cotton to sew up their clothes when they made a hole. They didn't spend it to fix the hole in the roof. But they were happy enough. Then one day their neighbour came across, and with her she brought a bowl containing 4 Bizan LADDOOs. And she said, I made too many, so I thought you might like them, because she liked her neighbours. And they took them, and they were so happy because they'd got them for free. They didn't cost a cent. And Bizan LADDOOs was the old man's very favourite dessert in the whole world. But they put them aside, and that night they had a meal of stale rice because they didn't want to spend money on fresh rice when they could get stale rice much cheaper. But after that, they got to eat the LADDOOs, and they had 2 each. And they licked up the crumbs, and they made them last as long as they could. They were fantastic. They could taste everything inside of them. But of course, then they were gone. The old man, for the next day and the day after that and the whole week, all he could talk about were these LADDOOs and how wonderful they were and how brilliant they were. And eventually he said to his wife, can you make me some? And he said, yes, of course, I can make some, but you'll have to spend some money. And he went, okay, give me an ingredient list and I will buy the ingredients. So she wrote out the list for him and gave it to him, and he went off and he bought just enough to make 4 LADDOOs, 2 each. And he brought the ingredients back, and his wife spent the next afternoon starting to make these LADDOOs. And he could smell the ghee melting, and he could smell the Bizan flour baking and toasting, and the cardamom as it started to roast as well, and all the smells, the pistachio nuts and the sugar. And eventually she said, here, husband, I've made the LADDOOs. And he was overjoyed, but he looked at them and he said, wife, what have you done? You've made 5. I thought you were only going to make 4, 2 each. Who's going to have the last LADDOO? And the wife thought, well, that's a bit much. Well, obviously, I made them. So I will have 3, and you will have 2. He wasn't happy about this. And he went, well, it was my idea to make them. I'll have 3 and you have 2. Well, that didn't please the wife. So they argued about it for a while, going backwards and forwards about who was going to have 3 and who was going to have 2. Eventually the wife said, why don't we cut the last LADDOO in half? Then we can share equally. Oh, don't be so stupid, said the man. You know, if you put a knife to that LADDOO, it's going to crumble and break, and it's so hard to make it into 2 even parts. You're right, husband. What are we going to do? And they thought for a while, and eventually the old man said, I have an idea. We'll have a game. The winner will get 3 LADDOOs. The loser, 2. Well, I've said, okay, but what game? The old man, he was wily. He knew a game that he could beat his wife at. Okay, the game will be that the first one who speaks will lose, and they will get 2 LADDOOs, and the winner will get 3. Wife looked at him and went, oh, I like to talk, but okay, let's do it. And so that night, they didn't talk. The next day, they didn't talk. And the night came round again, still they hadn't spoken. The next day, they started to do things to annoy each other. The old man burped really loudly, and the old woman went, oh, the game's still on. I won't say anything. So she dyed his best shirt with turmeric. The old man was absolutely mad. No, the game's on, I can't talk. So he just said nothing. Then he stopped doing his chores. The old woman was livid, but she couldn't say anything. She just couldn't say anything because the game was still on. So she put extra chili into his curry. It was too hot for him, but he didn't say a word. He spat out his food, knowing that would just annoy her so much. She was really annoyed, and she was as determined as her husband. Neither one of them were going to actually give in and talk. She didn't sweep his side of the room for days. Eventually, after this had been going on for a while, they were so tired that they put the 5 LADDOOs down on a low table and they lay down on the ground to rest. This was the same day that the neighbour was starting to get a little bit worried about them because she hadn't seen or heard from them for ages. So she came over to the house. She knocked on the door. There was no answer. So she called out, "Hello!" There was still no answer. So she banged on the door. And there was still no answer, for the couple was still lying quietly on the ground. Neither one of them wanted to get up and answer the door because they'd be asked a question and then they'd have to talk. And they would lose the last LADDOO. The neighbour was very worried, so she ran away to the village to get the villagers to come to see if they could raise this couple. Very, very worried. One of them jumped up onto the roof and he looked down through the hole in the roof and he could see the uneaten food, which in that house, uneaten food, and there were the man and the woman lying with their eyes closed and they weren't moving. He said, "They're dead, I think they're dead." So the villagers broke down the door and they ran in. Still, the couple didn't move. Neither one of them would move. They didn't want to be asked a question. They were not going to talk. And they heard the villagers making funeral plans for them. Now, you'd think that would make them get up, but no, they were so stubborn. Next thing you know, the villagers are carrying this couple out to the river, and they place them so gently on top of a pyre made of wood and logs, and the ceremonial funeral mantras were spoken. The fire was lit, and the flames crept higher. The old man was only wearing one layer of clothing, but his wife, she had a petticoat on underneath her sari, and that meant she had a little tiny bit more insulation than he did. And the flames got just that little bit bigger, and they nibbled at his toes, and his head sweated, and until he could no longer stand it, and he jumped up. And he said, you win, I can't stand it anymore. And she jumped up, and they jumped off of that pyre. The villagers, thinking they had seen ghosts because nobody had ever risen from a flaming pyre before, ran off in absolute horror. But the old couple, they were gleeful. Their game was over. And the old woman, she had won, so she was dancing around and she was singing, 3 for me and 2 for you. Oh, that's 3 for me and it's only 2 for you. The old man was a little bit upset, but he went, I can eat them slower than her, so she'll have to watch me finish eating. It'll be okay. And he got happy too. And they went back to their house and through the broken down door. Now you'd think this was a happy ending. Not so. For inside there was, fast asleep on the ground, a very fat-stomached stray dog with his nose in the bowl where the LADDOOs had been, all these crumbs around it, and this happy little smile on the sleeping dog's face. So, the old couple didn't have any LADDOOs. It was not a happy ending for them. For the dog, it was extremely happy. And for me, well, I have 5 LADDOOs. Would anybody like to share them? I know a game we can play about who gets the last one.